Welcome to All Those Kings, Good, Bad, the Ugly. Today we're going to talk about Jerusalem and Hezekiah. We're going to talk about the events that took place after the fall of Samaria. Last week we talked about the destruction of Samaria by the Assyrians, but the way it played out was this. The northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrians, and then they spread down the eastern seaboard. They spread into the eastern side of the Great Rift. And as a result, when all the dust settled, Judah had been turned into a tiny little island up in an Assyrian world. You have the city of Jerusalem, you have the city of Lachish, which we'll talk about in a moment. And aside from that and the small areas of territories around those two cities, everything was controlled by the Assyrians. And it would remain so for the next 100 and some years before Judah was destroyed by the Babylonians. The city of Jerusalem was just 50 miles from Samaria. However, the king in Jerusalem at that time, this is 10 years, 15 years prior to the fall of Samaria, was a man named Ahaz. He was the father of Hezekiah, Hezekiah, and he had entered into an arrangement with the Assyrians. It says he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. In other words, he was a pagan. He promoted pagan faiths. And he must have adopted Baalism at one point because it says he sacrificed his son in the fire. In other words, these little babies were being offered to pagan gods. But at one point, the kingdom of Judah had been threatened by the kingdom of Israel in combination with the Arameans just to the north, and they were attacking. And Ahaz went to the Assyrians, gave them a great deal of money and said, would you protect us? And they intervened and stopped the attacks on Judah. But from that point on, Ahaz was essentially a subject of the Assyrians. He continued to pay tribute. He admired their culture. And as a result, when Samaria fell, he was already regarded as within the Assyrian control and was left alone. And he continued to pay his tribute and cooperate with the Assyrians until he died. Now, he was on the throne with a co-regent, which is Hezekiah, his son. The two of them ruled together, and a co-regent was something like a junior king in training, something along those lines. The death of a king and the accession of the next king was always a time of chaos in the ancient world. These kings had numerous sons, all of whom felt entitled, and when a king died without having designated and prepared a successor, quite often you'd have conflict between the various princes, and you'd even have civil war in some cases. And external empires always looked on it as an opportunity perhaps to attack or acquire territory. And so what many of these kings would do as they got older is they'd bring their designated heir up onto the throne for 5 or 10 years, and they'd sit side by side and rule. And then when the king died, the junior king would be immediately promoted. He already had his alliances. He already had the people he worked with, and it would prevent the problems that often happened. So Ahaz, as a pagan working with the Assyrians, has been on the throne for many years, and he has his son Hezekiah. Ahaz was approached by the prophet of the day. In Jerusalem, there was a prophet named Isaiah. And Isaiah, if you read through the text, they've calculated he was prophet for perhaps as many as 60 years. He was still the prophet at the time of Hezekiah and died shortly thereafter. But that big book of Isaiah is that prophet in Jerusalem during the years before the fall of Samaria and then the few years afterwards. And he had gone to Ahaz and said, you should not put your faith in the Assyrians, put your faith in the Lord. And what's going to happen is that the Lord is going to punish Samaria, going to punish Damascus, which is the Arameans, and he'll do it with the Assyrians, and then eventually he's going to punish the Assyrians. And if you don't believe it, ask him for a sign, ask him for a test. And Ahaz said, I will not put the Lord to the test. This is something technically you're not supposed to do. You're never supposed to challenge. And so he said, no, I won't do that. So what Isaiah said was, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign to show that we are speaking truth. And I'm sure you all recognize this one. It says, the virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. Now, we all know that as a prophecy for the birth of Christ, and we've just been through the Christmas season talking about that. But the question is, how are we to interpret that? That has been a theological challenge for a long time, and there are possible interpretations. First of all, there are those who would argue that there's no such thing as fulfilled prophecy. A lot of theological leaders would argue that there is no such thing as fulfilled prophecy, which is astonishing to me. But they would argue that this was a prophecy meant for Ahaz. He wasn't sure what Isaiah was saying, so Isaiah said, okay, here's a sign. It would have to be fulfilled during his time to be an effective indication of truth. So that's one interpretation. There are those that say, no, it was simply meant as a prophecy to foreshadow the birth of Christ in 700 years, which to me is also a little bit silly because it still would have to have some meaning for Ahaz first, and then perhaps a foreshadowing, and that is the typical interpretation of this particular prophecy, that it's a double fulfillment. In other words, it was meant for Ahaz, something happened, and they're not sure who the woman was who had the baby, whether it was the wife of Ahaz or the wife of Isaiah. There are a couple of theories. But it also was used 700 years later to foreshadow the birth of Christ, and we see that in the book of Matthew. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet, the virgin will be with child and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. So I thought I'd throw that in simply because this is the time of Isaiah. This is an important prophecy, and this is when it happened. So back to Hezekiah. Hezekiah became the king about 5 years after the fall of Samaria. His daddy died. His daddy had been negotiating and cooperating with the Assyrians for years. Hezekiah continued that for a while. But he had been raised in a pagan environment, obviously. His father was a pagan, and he had apparently gone along with that because he was not the primary king. But it says as soon as he became king, he tried to restore the faith of Yahweh. Somehow he had been educated in the faith of Yahweh, and as soon as he had total control, he initiated lots of reform. It says in the first month of the first year of his reign, he opened the doors of the temple of the Lord and repaired them. The temple at this point probably was being abused by pagan worship. They may have even stuck pagan idols in it, but the temple was in disrepair, and so he repaired the temple. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He removed high places. He smashed the sacred stones and cut down the Asherah poles. In other words, he went through the countryside, and all these little shrines and these little temples that were being set up, he destroyed. It says he trusted in Yahweh, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, meaning the southern kingdom, either before him or after him. In other words, he was one of the best of these kings after the kingdom divided into two parts following the death of Solomon. I found this on the internet. It's kind of interesting. It says he cut down the Asherah poles. We don't know exactly what they were, but they were wooden totems of some sort. You take a tree trunk and carve some kind of a figure of Asherah on it, somewhat like a totem pole up in the Pacific Northwest. And so here's a fellow cutting down one of the Asherah poles. And when you read about that in the Bible, maybe you can think of it along these lines. It says the Lord was with him. He was successful in whatever he undertook. That's speaking of his theological activities, almost certainly, because he made a terrible, terrible decision that just about destroyed the kingdom of Judah. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. Now, what had happened, the king who was on the throne following the destruction of Samaria for the next 15 years was the fellow that we've been talking about, Sargon, and Sargon died. He died after Hezekiah had been king for several years, and he was followed by a man named Sennacherib that you can read about in the Bible. And at that moment, Assyria was vulnerable. Again, the change of a king and different problems that they might encounter. And the people of Judah, under Hezekiah, went into an alliance with the Egyptians and the other small kingdoms and the petty kings around that area. And they rebelled against Assyria in the sense that they stopped paying tribute, they started doing their own governance. And as you can imagine, the new king of Assyria, Sennacherib, was not very pleased with that behavior. And what he did was launch a huge military campaign against Judah. It says, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah. Now, what he did first, this was a process of a few years. He went down the coast and conquered all of those cities again. He subdued all of the small towns and cities around Jerusalem so that there would be no enemies behind them when they began to besiege the major cities. And then he sent a two-pronged attack in, one to a major city, Lachish. I'll show you pictures of that in a moment. And then an army up against Jerusalem as well. These were the two biggest cities in the area. Hezekiah apparently recognized that things were coming because he spent some time preparing for a battle. It says Hezekiah blocked all the springs and the stream that flowed through the land. In other words, everything outside of Jerusalem where there was a water supply, he blocked it up or he damaged it in such a way that it couldn't be used. When an army comes into a siege situation, they need lots of water. You have tens of thousands of soldiers, you have lots of animals, you need water. And by depriving them of water, it provides a challenge to the Assyrian army. But at the same time, it's providing a huge problem for the local populace. In other words, the people outside of Jerusalem are suffering because of what Hezekiah is doing to protect Jerusalem. He worked hard repairing all the broken sections of the wall. Areas of the wall fall down. These were not walls with mortar. These are piled stones, basically, huge piled stones, and you have to repair them from time to time. He built new towers that extend out beyond the wall so that when people are bringing their siege equipment against the wall, you're out here looking down on them as opposed to a flat wall. That's why all these towers are put into the big cities. It says he built another wall outside that one, and he reinforced the supporting terraces of the city of David. In other words, you have walls that are about halfway down the hill. He built another section of wall below that so that as you attack, you would have to break through the lower wall, and then there's kind of a no man's land, and you'd have to attack the major walls. So he was doing significant improvements and reinforcement of the fortifications. He made large numbers of weapons and shields. And he appointed military officers, so he began training soldiers. He didn't have a standing army. His army was a civilian army, men that would pick up swords and shields when they had to fight. The Assyrians, on the other hand, were a professional army. And they had various specialties. They had the sappers and the people that worked the battering rams, and they had various other groups, slingers, and then of course the archers, and then the infantry and cavalry. They had a standing army which was basically undefeatable in the field. It says it was Hezekiah who blocked the upper outlet of the Gihon spring and channeled the water down to the west side of the city of David. This is that famous Hezekiah's tunnel. Now, he was doing that to bring water inside the city walls. The Assyrians wouldn't have access to it, and they would have sufficient water to withstand a siege that might go on for 2 or 3 years. If you ran out of water in a siege, the siege would end in a couple of weeks, especially in the summer. It was hot and dry. If you didn't have water, you'd either die or surrender. If you had water and sufficient food, you could withstand a siege of 2 or 3 or 4 years with these big fortified walls. Now, it says Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. In other words, he went through the countryside. Remember, I told you last time that the term city refers to an urban center with a wall and a gate. It could be a tiny little town in our terminology, but city doesn't mean size the way we use it. It means a fortified site. And then the towns and the villages are all these collections of houses that are exposed, and the Assyrian army would just roll through them. And they pacified the entire countryside, and then they focused on Lachish and Jerusalem. Here is a reconstruction of what Lachish would have looked like. This is down in the foothills. there were really only two ways to get up into the hill country where Jerusalem was located, two major roads. This was all broken up limestone, and you'd have ridges and canyons, and there were only a couple of places where they had what's called a ridge route, where you could stay on basically flat ground connecting one section to another and get to the top. And at the bottom of one of those ridge routes was Lachish, this huge fortified city, one of the biggest cities in the region. The Assyrians would attack, in this case, primarily by building a siege ramp, and that's still there. You can walk up the siege ramp. I've done it. It's kind of interesting. They made a large area with enough of a slope that they could take battering rams up. The inhabitants in the city were trying to refortify the wall on the inside, so we can see the second wall that they were building, and unfortunately they were unsuccessful. The city fell and was destroyed. And today it's just a hill with some ruins that have been excavated. It's kind of a fun place to see, but this was one of the major defending cities into the hill country of Judah. So now Jerusalem is isolated up in the hill country, surrounded by an Assyrian army, and the Assyrian army that was down near Lachish can now go up and join the siege of Jerusalem. The Assyrians, question?
How long did it take to build the wall and
the siege ramp?
Yeah.
A few months probably. Some of these sieges would go on for 2 or 3 years. It took 7 months to build the siege ramp outside of Masada. The Romans built it. But there was already kind of a swale of land. They just reinforced it. The Assyrians were so proud of their destruction of Lachish, which was a major accomplishment, that they created this series of panels that were put in the throne room. You can get a sense of size. A little railing down around the bottom shows how big people. These are huge panels that went all the way around the throne room, and it's a series of cartoon images showing the succession of events that occurred in the siege of Lachish. Here is one little section, for example. And what you have in just this little panel, you have a stylized city of Lachish, the panel that you see right, or the little structure that you see there. You see the ramps that were around the outside of the city. You see a battering ram with archers behind it. And in the next little section, you see refugees being taken away. Down below, you have soldiers who have resisted the Assyrians and are being impaled and tortured, which is something that the Assyrians love to do. And so there's a whole series of these panels that show people giving tribute to the king and being taken into Assyria, and this is where we get a lot of our information about how the processes of siege took place. This is probably a little closer representation of what the siege of Lachish might have been. You can see the city, which is on a hill surrounded by ramps. You have battering rams that are being brought against the gates and the towers. Over in this section, that's a representation of sappers. They would, under protection, they would dig down under the walls, create a tunnel that was supported by timbers. And then when the tunnel went far enough back under the wall, they'd ignite the timbers. Sappers would try to run out before the tunnel collapsed, and in many cases not able to do so. And then the tunnel would collapse and bring down a section of the wall, creating a breach that you could get in. So a siege was a terrible thing to go through, aside from the fact that you're starving inside. And we talked about that last time. People turned to cannibalism during these sieges. So at this point, they've been surrounding Jerusalem. Lachish has fallen. And the king of Assyria sent his supreme commander from Lachish to Hezekiah up in Jerusalem to negotiate. Stands outside the wall and starts calling up to the people on top. And Eliakim was sent to negotiate. Hezekiah, as a king, would never submit to the requirement that he step out on the wall and negotiate with an enemy. And the supreme commander of Assyria had been calling up saying, "You people need to surrender. You're going to fall. The Lord has sent us to take down your city. Your own God has asked us to do this. And here are the things that are going to happen if you don't surrender." And at that point, Eliakim said to the field commander, "Please, speak to your servants, speak to us in Aramaic. Don't speak to us in Hebrew in the hearing of the people on the wall." Now, this is kind of a curious little thing, so I thought I'd take a moment to explain it. Aramaic was the diplomatic language of the world at that time, the way English is today. Everybody spoke Aramaic in governance, and all of the various trade people spoke Aramaic, but the local people spoke Hebrew. And the negotiator here is calling up to them in Hebrew saying, here's what's going to happen, and Eliakim doesn't want the people in the city to hear what's going to happen. He doesn't want them to lose heart. So he said, please don't speak in Hebrew, which all these people understand. Speak to us in Aramaic, which I understand. And the commander said, well, my master, the king, sent me to say these things also to the men sitting on the wall who, like you, will have to eat their own filth and drink their own urine. In other words, if things continue, they're going to suffer, and they deserve to hear what's going to happen to them. Well, negotiations broke down, so a letter was sent to Hezekiah from the king of Assyria, and Hezekiah was terribly distraught. It says he went up to the temple of Yahweh, spread the letter out before Yahweh, and prayed to Yahweh, asking for deliverance. And at this point, Isaiah sent a message to Hezekiah saying, this is what Yahweh says, I will defend this city and save it for my sake and for the sake of David, my servant. In other words, you will be delivered. That night, the angel of Yahweh went out and put to death 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp. So the city was delivered. The Assyrian army was destroyed. It says, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew, returned to Nineveh, and stayed there. And then several years later, he was assassinated by one of his sons, Esarhaddon. Assyria went into a decline, and at that point never threatened Jerusalem again. Although at that point, Hezekiah returned to paying his tribute, and the city of Jerusalem limped through the next 125 years as a tiny little island in this Assyrian world, paying tribute and behaving as good subjects of the Assyrians. Unfortunately, the rebellion against Assyria was tremendously costly to Judah. Hezekiah had survived. He was still on the throne. But the kingdom of Judah had been ravaged by Assyria and lay in ruins. The armies had been in there for years. They'd been attacking the countryside. They'd been looting and raping and killing. And the countryside was devastated as a result. Much of their territory, as punishment, had been sectioned off and given to some of the local warlords in the area who had not participated in the rebellion. So they lost a lot of their territory, and the taxes and the economic support that Jerusalem would have received from those territories. But in addition to losing their economic base, they had to pay penalties to Assyria as well. They had to pay more tribute. Their taxes were raised. They were forced to give what are referred to as gifts to the various royalty along the way. So the kingdom was reduced in size, taxes were increased. It had already been nearly destroyed by 3 or 4 years of rebellion, and so they suffered dramatically for the next generation at least. I thought this would be a good time just to look at the city of Jerusalem. We talk about it in the Bible, but the geography of the countryside is dramatic, and it helps explain some of the things that happened. What you see here, looking to the north as you can see, is a spit of land that had a city on it above the water supply, and this was the city that was conquered by David. It was simply this little spit of land. It's about 10 acres in size. And depending on how you calculate how many houses there were and how many people living in a house inside the walls, it's been estimated this is a population of 1,500 to 2,000 perhaps. In other words, the city of David, the city of Jerusalem, while heavily fortified, was a tiny, tiny little backwoods city up in the hill country. There's a valley along the east side there. That's the Kidron Valley, or the King's Valley, that we read about in the Bible. We would call that a gully. Now you have to remember, Israel's a tiny country, and when they talk about mountains, those are big hills to us, and when they talk about valleys, those are really gullies. But off to the east of that is a huge ridge that runs north to south, and that's the Mount of Olives. So you had the Mount of Olives off there to the east, looking down over the city of Jerusalem. There was a huge valley that ran up the west side of the city. That's the Central Valley. But the water supply was located down in the Kidron Valley, below the city. You had the city up on the hill, the water table's down here. And every city has to make an effort to protect its water supply so that the attacking armies can't get to it. And this is something that was just discovered. This is just in the last 15 years or so. They discovered that there is a fortification that was built around the spring down in the bottom of the Kidron Valley and attached to the walls. And this is kind of a representation of what it might have looked like at the time. That changes every year. With new discoveries, they keep adding to what the shape of it was, but this is probably pretty close. The water would run from the spring and fill a reservoir, and then these massive walls around the outside would prevent enemies from getting to their water supply. So the city of David was as you see there. That massive fortification around the spring predates David. So when he conquered the city, there was a tunnel leading into that, and the Bible says that David used the water shaft, or the tzinor is the Hebrew word. He was able to get into that little enclosure and presumably open gates and allow the city to fall. The hill to the north is Mount Moriah. And you read about David buying the threshing field of Araunah, which was up on Mount Moriah, and building an altar there. And then when Solomon became king, he built the temple up on Mount Moriah, built himself a nice palace, and then enclosed this whole area, this whole teardrop shape area, as the city of Solomon at that time, still located on this small spit of land above the spring. Now, time passed. We have Hezekiah on the throne with his father Ahaz. Assyria's rampaging around Samaria up the road, and huge numbers of refugees came down from the north, fled down trying to escape the Assyrians, and where they had to live was on this big hill off to the west. That's called the Western Hill, or it's called the Upper City in the New Testament, because it's actually higher than the older section of the city. And the problem with that is they built walls around the city. They built walls around that Western Hills, but the problem is the water supply is located to the east of the city. And if you've been in the Western Hill and you walk all the way down to the spring, and these are girls and women carrying pots, and as much water as you can carry is just a few gallons, and you have to walk that all the way back to the Western Hill, it's a terrible hardship. But Hezekiah's engineers apparently had recognized that water was trickling out of the hillside, right there where you saw that little sparkling blue thing. The city is built on limestone, layers of limestone, 2 layers. One has cracks vertically and one has cracks horizontally. And water leaks through these cracks, and he found that there was water coming from the Gihon Spring out the southern end of the city there. And you can determine that very easily. Sprinkle dye into the water, and eventually the dye comes out at the southern end. You know where it's coming from. So what he did, he recognized that there was a crack coming through this limestone. It's not a straight crack. It's a winding crack, obviously, and water is leaking through there. And all you had to do was tunnel from one end and the other end, follow the crack till you could join in the middle, which is how he built the tunnel. Maintain the proper slope, and water will run from the spring to the south end of the city. Now, I make it sound easy. This is an enormous engineering feat. This is one of the great engineering feats of the ancient world, and it doesn't get any credit. But what Hezekiah did was build that tunnel following the Gihon Spring to the southern end, and he built a dam across that central valley. And what does that do? It creates a reservoir. It creates a reservoir with water for everybody. He included the dam as part of the city wall and then ran the wall all the way around the city, and so the water supply was safely inside the city during the time of the siege. Now, that reservoir is called the Siloam Pool, and you may know that from the New Testament. That's a pool that was eventually made into a very elegant pool. We don't know if it was meant as a mikveh for the Jewish worshipers or whether the Romans were using it as one of their baths, but it was a very elegant pool by the time of the Romans 700 years later. Here's a picture of the steps today leading down to the spring from the outside. And you can see you go down the steps, there's a little tunnel down there and a little chamber, which is where the spring is located. Now, if you go down those steps, you have to go across a little platform, and then there's a small room in there that has water. It comes and goes. Siloam means gushing. Water will fill and then ebb and flow back and forth. And what he did, if you step down into that little chamber, the tunnel continues out the back side of it. And here is a picture of that little chamber. Now imagine digging through the bedrock. You're 100 feet below the surface. You have to have air into the tunnel. You have to have light. You have to have some mechanism for getting the excavated material out. This is an amazing engineering accomplishment. They were following a pre-existing path, which is why the tunnel is not straight. But nevertheless, it's a tremendous challenge. Here is what much of the tunnel looks like. It's pitch black. That was a flash picture. You have to go through with flashlights or whatever. And you can see the quarry marks up the walls and across the top where they chiseled it out. Now, there are some places where it was apparently a very small area, so they made a tiny little tunnel, just big enough for a man to go through. That's about 5.5 feet, which is about the average size of an Israelite in those days. And in some places, the path was so large that they didn't have to do anything to it. There are no quarry marks on the top or on the sides. So you have this gap that was running through the limestone, and they simply followed it, created the proper grade so that water would run, and then created the reservoir at the south end. And this has been excavated just in the last 10 years. This was all filled in with dirt 10 years ago, but they've started excavating, and you can see the steps to the Siloam pool that date back to the Roman time. The water would come out and fill this pool, and here is the water would come perhaps to that level. And here is a diorama that was created as to what it might have looked like during Roman times. Now, during Hezekiah's time, it was just a big pool of water, but it provided the water for the survival of the city during the Assyrian siege. The city wall itself was probably as you see it there. When the Assyrians came and were attacking the city, they would have been attacking what you see there. And the city is surrounded by very deep valleys on each side. And I thought I'd give you a couple of pictures of that. If you you have the Kidron Valley, and then you have the Hinnom Valley off to the west, and to the south a very, very deep culvert that runs around the south end of the city. If you stand there and look down that valley, which is the Hinnom Valley, this is where they had the temples to Baal, where they were burning babies and so forth. The Hinnom Valley, it's called Gehenna in the New Testament. Some of you may know that term, and it's a reference to hell. It would have smelled, it would have had dead bodies in there. That's where the sewage went, this valley down to the south there. But if you stand at that area and look, here's what you see. There's the city, there are the city walls up there. And look at the depth of that valley all the way down to the Kidron Valley. Now imagine an Assyrian army trying to attack the city from this side. It'd be very difficult. If you stand at that area and look down into Kidron Valley from the city walls, you can see how steep the walls are to the east side of the city. And where I'm standing in this picture is fairly close to where David probably stood looking over the terrace and saw Bathsheba. You can see the city is layered down below you because it's so steep. And if you stand down in the valley and look up, you can see the city walls up on top there. That's roughly the view that the Assyrian soldiers would have had. The only place to attack the city is from the north, where it's flat. That's where all the attacks came. The Crusaders fought there, the Romans fought there, the Assyrians fought there, the Babylonians fought there, because it's the one place where you can lay an army out and bring battering rams and siege equipment. So that's where most of the attacks would take place, simply because there is no way to attack a city up these steep hills, which is why the cities were built up on steep hills. which puts the water supply down below. And you can see the different problems that they would encounter. But when you have a sense of what was there, a lot of what we read in the Bible starts to make sense. All right, so that's where we stand at this point. We have the isolated little island of Judah surrounded by the Assyrians. They limp along for the next 100 and some years, but the Assyrians fall on hard times. The Babylonians conquer them. The people of Judah didn't learn from their experience with the Assyrians, and they begin to conspire against the Babylonians. And so the Babylonians complete the task of destroying the city of Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah. And we'll talk about that next time with King Josiah and his successors. Next week, we're going to talk about Josiah the king. There was a very prominent prophet in Jerusalem at that time. His name was Jeremiah, so we'll talk a little bit about him as well. We're going to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem and exile to Babylon. So very important things. It's our last class. You don't want to miss it.